Welcome to the Bonhoeffer Show with Bill Hull. The show about stuff most people try to avoid, but can't because it controls their lives. Religion, culture, and politics. Why does Bill Hull host this show? Because he and Bonhoeffer hoisted a few brews together in Berlin. Nope. That never happened. Is it that Bonhoeffer's book, The Cost of Discipleship, both challenged and changed Bill as a young man? Well, yes, that is part of it. But it's primarily because Bonhoeffer called us to a costly discipleship. And there has never been a time when such courage has been more absent or desperately needed than now. Bonhoeffer famously said, "Christianity without discipleship is always Christianity without Christ." The Bonhoeffer Project is committed to turning leaders into disciple makers. Because if leaders fail to create disciple-making movements, then we have failed. So, ladies and gentlemen, here he is. He's still tall and good-looking. And yes, he is wearing German cologne. He's acquired a few more underlying conditions. But direct from his underground bunker in Long Beach, California, the man who once told Don Henley, "You can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave," Bill Hull.
Well, thank you, Steve Simmons, and welcome to another edition of the Bonhoeffer Show podcast. Today, we're going to talk about how we got what we have. And I'm talking really about the world in which we're living right now, and things are moving so fast. And you know, in the previous programs, we've been talking about just what's been happening around our country in particular with respect to the changes that we're undergoing, and everybody notices them, everybody has them, experiencing them, for everything from COVID to presidential elections to the role of big tech, big media, big sport, everybody, and how it's beginning to, how the people who are, some people are making huge amounts of money during the COVID time. Let's say Amazon, for example, the most obvious one, where Jeff Bezos is becoming richer and richer and richer and richer and richer. So it's because of all those packages that we keep ordering and keep coming to our homes. All right, so we know that stuff's going on, it's moving really fast. And so let's slow down a moment and go back to the year of 410. Yes, the year that Rome was sacked by the Goths, by the barbarians. In 410, when St. Augustine, who at that time was a priest who was living in Alexandria, or actually in a place outside of Alexandria called Hippo. He was the bishop of Hippo eventually. But St. Augustine received the news that his beloved Rome had fallen to the barbarians. He loved Rome. He loved everything about Rome. He was shaken, and he went into a period of mourning. But almost immediately, he was constrained to construct a philosophical and theological arc. In his case, what we call orthodoxy, wherein his church would survive the days ahead. Augustine was a great scholar and professor of rhetoric, eventually ascending to the University of Milan in Italy. It was there he came under the influence of the great Bishop Ambrose, and because of Ambrose's influence, he became a Christian. He began to study the Bible. His conversion took place in the garden in Milan. As he sat in the garden, he heard a sing-song of a child in a nearby home. "Take it up and read it. Take it up and read it." So he opened up his copy of the Gospels to the St. Paul's epistle to the Romans and read, "Not in reveling and drunkenness, not in lust and wantonness, not in quarrels or rivalries. Rather, arm yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ. Spend no more thought on nature or nature's appetites." Augustine became disillusioned, calling his position at the university as the chair of lies. He was the professor of rhetoric at the University of Milan. Very much like our present conditions, he found himself, as revealed in his confessions, really what people consider the very first autobiographical work, that he was addicted to luxury, violence, and self-indulgence. He really did have an eye for the ladies as well. Augustine was particularly addicted to sexual pleasure, which he concluded offered a fraudulent ecstasy, joys that expire when the neon lights go out, even though there were no neon lights, but when the lights go out. He returned to North Africa to pursue a new career. He planned a private monastic life with a few close friends, but his gifts were too great. He was already too famous, his reputation too big, and the need for his leadership too precious for a cloistered life. So he went to Hippo because they already had a bishop and a priest, and he thought maybe people would leave him alone, but the church snapped him up and made him a priest. And then not very much longer later, a bishop. He was 43 years old when he became bishop of Hippo. Now we return to 410 when Rome fell. This is when he went to work on his massive theological masterpiece, the City of God. It was set against the city of man. The city of man was Rome. The city that he loved was flawed and it had fallen. The city of God, however, would never fail or fall. This work occupied him for 17 years. Now, I've written a lot of books, but I don't think I've ever worked on the same one for 17 years. It was a great treatise on what man owed to God and what to Caesar. He wrote, quote, "The heavenly city outshines Rome beyond comparison. There, instead of victory is truth, instead of high rank, holiness, instead of peace, the state of well-being, instead of life, eternity." The City of God was written to counteract the accusation among disappointed Romans in 410 and afterward that Christianity was the reason that Rome fell. I know that this was very popular, made popular by Edwin Gibbon in his Rise and the Fall and Decline of the Roman Empire, volume 2 or 3, as I recall. And he said that the nonviolent idea of Christianity, the Sermon on the Mount, basically that the Romans felt that Christianity made them weaker, not stronger. Rome had ruled for 1,000 years, and now their walls had been breached and their once great kingdom had been broken up. The Mediterranean Sea was no longer a Roman pond. Many Romans blamed the abandonment of the traditional gods and goddesses. Augustine answered with an alternative worldview and also gave Christians a vision for the future, as said before, an arc to get the church through an uncertain period. Augustine called his chair of rhetoric a chair of lies. It is demonstratively true that we now live in an empire of lies. How do we get through? Well, we're going to ask our two guest hosts today, Cindy Perkins, our executive director of the Bonhoeffer Project, and lead pastor at Oceanside Calvary Chapel, Dan Leitz. So let's take a break, listen to the man with the golden pipes, and we'll be right back.
We turn leaders into disciple makers. That's the mission of the Bonhoeffer Project. But before we can turn you into a disciple-making leader, we need you to be in a cohort. A cohort is a 1-year, 10-meeting, book reading, pray, wrestling, writing, planning challenge that has the potential to change you and thus redirect your life. Interested? Here's the process. Go to our website, thebonhoefferproject.com, and complete the application form. We will contact you. We will then help you select the type of cohort that's best for you. In person, online, or online school, which is asynchronous, so it's not affected by time zones and anyone in the world can access it. Oh, and training is now also available in Spanish. In the meantime, subscribe to the show, read one of Bill's books, and send us a question you want Bill or some member of the Bonhoeffer team to answer. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back. We're now going to talk a little bit more about Well, I guess what we might call moral authority, because there's a shift in moral authority in our country. And it affects Christians in this way. Is the Bible our moral authority? Is the church moral authority? Or is it wider culture? Let me explain what moral authority is. Now, I'll just give you an example. Moral authority is what an African American has in any discussion with a white regarding race. The poetic truth erases the distinction between fact and narrative. A poetic truth, I think, pretty much coined this term by Shelby Steele, a scholar, an African-American scholar, 74 years old, at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University. He said, this is poetic truth then is something that might well be true for the sake of narrative and coherence, whether or not it is ultimately true to the facts. For example, the facts say that 19 Black people were shot by white cops in 2020. Poetic truth is that Black men are being hunted by white cops. It may be true that racist cops exist. In fact, I'm sure they do exist. But it's not true that most cops are racist. But then again, what makes a racist is unclear and is normally defined by a Black person's personal opinion, which is based on lived experience, which of course is a moving target, subjective, and almost impossible to define. That's the reason that when you hear white supremacy, when you hear racist, when you hear these terms, the goalposts keep moving because you don't know who is and who isn't and on what day it is. It's very confusing to people. To my point, a Black person can get away with making all kinds of statements that people from the white or the oppressor class cannot make. The white oppressor is considered guilty and has no authority to speak. The best example I've seen lately is a young Black activist with some conservative views was debating a white ruling class elite from a popular magazine. The young Black defended some very conservative views, and the white ruling class progressive was helpless to debate him because of the massive white guilt that weighed him down and kept his mouth shut. He didn't think he had the moral authority to speak. Thus, he kept quiet. The Black man possessed a moral innocence coming from a historically oppressed race. This is normal operating procedure today. The public narrative conflates the pre-1960s racial politics with what is actually true today. So it feeds off of grievance, and grievance gives you leverage, and leverage is power. And so how do we get to the poetic truth, replacing historical fact or even current research? And I think essentially what this 1960s was about, and at least two of us here can remember the 1960s. I was actually a college student. I think I'm the only one who was in college at the time in our group today. But there were 5 movements that were birthed in the 1960s that really revealed this good nation's hypocrisy. Our Declaration of Independence and Constitution was and remains aspirational. Our grand experiment is a nation when the people governing themselves had created the greatest society on earth, but we had fallen short. And the 1960s exploded around our shortcomings. The movements below represent the pathways that solved some problems, disrupted the national calm, and divided us philosophically. The Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, women's movement, sexual revolution, and the environmental movement. And 1968 was the year that the entire culture became aware of hypocrisy. Shelby Steele put it this way, quote, "Has there ever been a single year in all American history in which American way of life came so thoroughly under siege? It was hard for anyone to go into that year and come out the same person." So in general, these movements exposed hypocrisy, an issue where Americans needed reform. The leaders wanted the American people, as well as the government, to say, yes, your grievance against America is legitimate and it deserves to be taken seriously and resolved. The Civil Rights Movement led the way. The problem was clear, easy to define, and the government could act as it did with the 1964 Civil Rights Act to make it illegal to discriminate based on race. The women's movement, the anti-war movement, the sexual revolution all won the day in the face of American hypocrisy. By 1968, there was no longer legitimate support for racial oppression, sexism, and arrogance of power abroad with, for example, the Vietnam War. The nation was in moral crisis, and the moral authority of the culture began to shift. It became more honorable to resist the rule of law than to submit to it. This led to the collapse of authority. In 1968, you questioned everything: your parents, your college, your marriage, the military draft, sexual mores, and especially your religion. Rebellion made you authentic, which gave you moral authority to speak truth to power. All right. Now, that's a lot. I had to talk a long time to get us to this point. And then maybe my guest host can dig us out of the hole I just dug. So we're going to take another break briefly, and then we're going to come back and try to begin to build on this analysis and what we can know and where we need to go. So let's hear more from Steve Simmons.
If you want to expand the disciple-making movement, then share the show with your friends and colleagues. Hey, it's easy to subscribe. Simply go to iTunes or to our website, thebonhoefferproject.com. Then click on The Bonhoeffer Show. Once you do, we will keep you updated with the Bonhoeffer Project's events, new materials and books, as well as the larger disciple-making movement current news. You can also access previous programs. And be sure to read Bill's weekly column, which is posted on the website. Remember, ask questions. Bill's answers are guaranteed to give you herd immunity, increase your IQ, and cause you to experience waves of euphoria. Well, not really, but his answers are really good. And now, let's get back to the Bonhoeffer Show.
We're back, and remember to go to our website, thebonhoefferproject.com, where you can sign up for one of our cohorts, and that's what we do. We turn leaders into disciple makers, and we'd love to have you as part of one of our cohorts in 2021. All right. I'm going to turn first to Cindy Perkins, our executive director and professor at Trinity University in Florida. Cindy, I filled up your brain with a lot of stuff here. Respond.
So I was thinking about this. I grew up, came of age in the late 60s, early 70s, and I graduated in 75, but I was being formed in the late 60s. And I think when I look back and say, how did we get here? It started even before that. In 1962, I think, when we started taking prayer and God out of our schools. I grew up in a small town in West Virginia, and we were caused to enter Bible classes until I hit junior high school. Then they were optional for us and still available in high school. So where I was, we were still in that place of transition. We had the Civil War affected us greatly. The Civil Rights Movement, affected us greatly. Vietnam War, that was, as I was coming through high school, that was a big piece of what we did. And everything that seemed right and good no longer was right and good. And we began to question what everybody believed. And the Jesus movement had begun, but it was, I feel like when I look back on it, Jesus light. And so you add all of these pieces in, and then we're back to, I want to be God in my own life. I want to make my decisions. I want to do what I want to do. And I don't want you telling me what to do. And by the way, these things are wrong, right? The sexual revolution, the women's movement, those were the days of Helen Reddy, I am woman, hear me roar. And so there was no biblical understanding of where women sat in the church, in homes, and we began to see the degradation of homes, of the nuclear family, and then the church, and then society at large. So I think it's a long stretch that has been happening over my lifetime. I look around and I say, where am I? Because this is not the America that I grew up in, but with the places that we were in those times and the progression of thought that happened, it's no wonder that we're not the America that we grew up with.
But one of the things that we have to come to terms with is, I think if somebody's listening to this podcast, they'll say, yeah, you guys, you're from previous generations, but isn't this a better world that we're living in now, where people are more sensitive to other people? People are, women do have more rights. Women are looked at differently. That the African Americans, basically are free. That's a thing that scares. The grievance industry is scared about the fact that if we just say, okay, now, hey, you're free, go do it.
Yeah.
And they say, well, maybe not. We don't really feel free. Well, what's going to make you feel free? It's that kind of conversation that nobody really wants to have. Yeah. Dan, what do you think?
What comes to mind already is the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Mm-hmm. I think about just all of the societal changes that have been thought of as progressing our society, as further making things more fair, more tolerant, more open. But when definitions of words change, you may say the same word, but you mean different things. And so when you say, man, our world has gotten way more tolerant, you're not saying what it used to mean. Tolerant simply used to mean, hey, I disagree with you, but I'm not going to slash your tires. I'm not going to punch you in the face. Now tolerance is you have to agree with me or you're intolerant. So as you were talking about, if the goalposts keep moving, there's no foundation. And again, this is all linked to truth decay, morality decay. But at the same time, again, I'm going to play a bit of devil's advocate on this one. Is a moral culture a real reflection of people's hearts? Because you can legislate morality all you want, but if behind closed doors, the things that are illegal are still taking place, is the culture more moral than if those laws were, because we have tons of laws on the books right now, or I would say a ton of things that are legal, but not moral, things that the Bible would condemn, but they're totally legal in the culture. So we can look at those and say, well, hey, it's legal. I mean, adultery's legal. God frowns upon it. Certain types of theft are legal because, well, it's not a big deal. It was small. It was this, it was that. You get a slap on the wrist. So I just see the veil has come off. I mean, in our culture now, the veil is not the biblical veil that was torn in the temple, but I mean, the veil of a moral society has come off. And I think, to be honest with you, it's obviously socially not my favorite thing, but biblically, I'm actually more excited because people are more ripe, because truth is standing in opposition to what this culture has now.
Well, there's a whole bunch of things that I could say at this point, but one of the reasons that people started teaching that the great evils, the shift in moral authority was the great evil now is, let's say, discrimination, racial discrimination. The
Sure.
Great evil is economic oppression. The great evil is the fact that women can't hold certain jobs, or women can't vote, or whatever it happened to be at the time. And so what happened is, and this gets back to what Reinhold Niebuhr and what I was saying in earlier programs, systemic sin, societal sin was worse than individual sin. So you take a guy like Martin Luther King, who everyone knows was a womanizer to some degree. That doesn't mean he wasn't a great man or that he didn't do great things, because he did. But the problem is they would give him a pass on the private individual stuff. And that's been the way it has been, is if you're virtuous enough in the really important societal issues, then people will cut you slack. You're such a great president, we're going to cut you slack over here. You're such a great leader, we're going to cut you some slack over here. So maybe, you're fooling around, or maybe you stole this or you took that. Those are things that that people got away with because they had this moral authority.
Right.
And so, I was just thinking about things like this. Like, I have a list here of just things that we used to make fun of, like microaggressions on the college campus, safe zones, gender neutral bathrooms, suppression of free speech, the harassing of harassing of people's points of view on the college campus, all this kind of stuff. The cancel culture and the political correctness, and it used to be funny, but now it's no longer funny because now it's become authoritarian.
Yeah.
Well, and
Absolutely.
I think about the fact too that society, you talked about the individual sins versus societal sins, but we have to remember that society is a sum of its parts, right? So we, as we are a part of the society, a part of the collective, just like a church is not a building, it's the collection of the people who call that church home. And so where we are with the sin in our lives is going to directly and profoundly affect the collectives to which we belong, starting with our family and then the church and then society. It's going to affect all of it. And so it really comes back to, what do we do with individual sin? Where is that? Where is my responsibility as part of society?
Yeah, it's interesting within the church, the Christian world, in the last few years, that we've had, everything from Bill Hybels to James MacDonald to Mark Driscoll to recently Jerry Falwell Jr. and other people who have basically fallen from grace, Ravi Zacharias, and all these people. It's really nothing new under the sun, because they all were so famous and so effective that they thought the rules didn't apply to them. That they thought, everybody's going to cut me a little bit of slack, and that is very human. And that happens. I just want to say it happens in the religious world just as much in many often cases as the secular world and the political world. But I think the difference is that all of these evangelicals have been disgraced now. And maybe that's one difference, is that eventually when it came right down to it, people were letting it go. But then when it came public, the church couldn't let it go. What do you guys think?
Well, right. When we stand or espouse moral truth, and there is absolutes, we have to hold ourselves to those truths, even though the world doesn't. They're the first ones to point the finger to say, well, you say that moral truth, all these other things, right? So we have to hold ourselves accountable to those things and not look to even what I like to call the celebrity pastor. Those are the, don't put people on pedestals. Because fame, fortune, and all that stuff, that's the quick road to disaster. Because if Satan can take you out, oh man, there's a lot of people he's going to take with. There's a lot of collateral damage for those things.
Yeah.
I think too, we have to remember that we are ambassadors for Christ. We are his representatives. So our standard must be higher. And that's where, as we talked about in a previous episode, that's where community comes in, that accountability that says, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. It's not okay. Right. And so when we don't allow ourselves to be held accountable, then we set ourselves up for that kind of failure that does damage to the reputation of our kingdom.
Yeah.
God.
Yesterday, I got a big laugh out of John Kerry, who ran for president and was a U.S. senator, and of course has been in the public eye for many a year, has become the czar of climate control or whatever. I'm not sure exactly what the title is.
Climate change, I think.
Climate change. And that he had flown up to Iceland on his private jet to receive an award for, environmentalism. And he was asked, recently, then at that time, they just found the tape of it recently, that why, he had emitted more carbon footprint flying up there than most people do in 3 lifetimes. And they asked him, wasn't that a little bit hypocritical? And he said, well, a person like me who has to get to places and meet with people and make decisions. In other words, I'm important and I have to move around and I can't be distracted by commercial air and all this kind of thing. And I thought that's the same exact thing that Ken Copeland and Jesse Duplantis said when they were arguing about the need for their own private jets as televangelists, and that because there were evil spirits and you couldn't have a clear channel for God to speak to you while you're traveling and flying. So you need privacy so God can meet you in that special little container that's flying through the air.
God does not speak in coach.
Exactly. God, that's a good line. You ought to probably use that. God doesn't speak in coach. So, that's God doesn't speak in coach or in commercial air. And it worked for John Kerry and it worked for some of our friends. So anyway, I just thought that was hilarious. And I got a good laugh out of it. Well, one thing is for sure, we're living in a topsy-turvy world. It reminds me of Isaiah 5:20, where light is declared darkness and darkness declared light, and where evil is good and good is evil. We are right now in the midst of all that. And I like what you said, Dan, truth decay. That's a good one. I can use that. So I guess we've kind of exhausted the subject. And so I know that we've had a good program, and we all, again, want to invite you to become part of the Bonhoeffer Project. You can actually meet Dan, and you could meet Cindy. We'd love to meet you. You can't meet me because I never leave home, but I think everybody else that you could probably meet at some time or the other. And so remember this: follow Jesus, and he'll teach you everything you'll ever need to know.
Well, we hope that the show wasn't too bad. Jane Hull wants everyone to know that if anything Bill said was offensive, she feels your pain. If you were upset by anything Bill and his guests said, well, mission accomplished. At the Bonhoeffer Show, we value irreverent, satirical, and generally inappropriate behavior. But when it comes to fulfilling the Great Commission, we don't mess around. Remember, subscribe. We promise. No private jets, no white suits, and definitely no toupees.